Imagine boarding a routine flight, expecting nothing more than the usual hum of engines and the murmur of fellow passengers. The seats, the safety instructions, the familiar scent of recycled air, it all feels ordinary. But then, one simple act of entitlement sends shockwaves through the cabin. Dominic Carter, a man whose calm presence radiates authority and empathy, finds himself at the center of an unfolding storm. A passenger refuses to accept his seat, challenging not just airline rules, but the very principles of fairness and respect. As tensions rise, questions hang in the air heavier than the cabin's recycled oxygen. How far will people go to assert privilege? Can reason and calm overcome raw aggression? What does courage look like in the face of entitlement and discrimination? Dominic's internal struggle is as gripping as the confrontation itself, balancing self-control, ethical responsibility, and the subtle power of influence. Every passenger becomes a witness, every choice a lesson. This isn't just a flight, it's a test of character, empathy, and morality that will leave you questioning your own reactions in moments of conflict. Will justice prevail, or will entitlement win buckle up? Because what happens next is both shocking and profoundly human. If you're ready to experience the full story, hit like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel. Let's dive in. The hum of the engines filled the first-class cabin, blending with the faint rustle of newspapers and the clink of glasses as flight attendants moved briskly between the wide leather seats. Most passengers were already reclining with pre-flight champagne or sparkling water in hand. The atmosphere was calm, orderly, exactly what one would expect from a premium flight on a late Thursday afternoon. But then, a shift. Dominic Carter, dressed in dark jeans, a crisp button-down shirt, and a worn leather jacket, walked down the aisle with boarding pass in hand. His posture was calm, steady, the kind of presence that didn't demand attention but couldn't be ignored. At 6'2", with broad shoulders and skin the shade of polished mahogany, Dominic carried himself with a quiet authority that came not from arrogance, but from years of discipline. He stopped at seat 2A, placed his bag in the overhead compartment, and sat down without fuss. He nodded politely at the middle-aged businessman across the aisle, who was already swirling a glass of whiskey. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but the shift came quickly, almost invisible to those who weren't watching closely. Rachel Hayes, the lead flight attendant, had just moments before greeted another passenger, a white man in a golf polo, with a dazzling smile and a cheerful, "Welcome aboard, Mr. Daniels. Let me help you with your seat." She had personally guided him to 2B, placing his carry-on gently into the overhead bin. When she reached Dominic, her smile faltered. She glanced at his boarding pass, then back at his face. Her tone flattened. "Down to the left," she said curtly, making no effort to assist. Dominic met her eyes for just a moment, said nothing, and moved toward his seat. He had lived through enough of these moments to recognize the subtle sting. No welcome, no warmth, just an instruction, as though his presence was a nuisance. Rachel turned away almost instantly, returning to her polished smile as another white passenger approached. Dominic leaned back in his seat, opened his notebook, and began jotting small notes in careful handwriting. He wasn't angry, not outwardly, but the seed had been planted. Minutes later, Olivia Moore, one of the younger flight attendants, moved briskly down the aisle with a tray of pre-flight beverages. She stopped at Michael Anderson, the businessman across the aisle, and asked with a warm smile, "Sparkling water or orange juice for you, sir?" He chose sparkling water, which he poured into a glass with practiced elegance. When she reached Dominic, She glanced briefly at him, then continued past without a word. Dominic raised his hand slightly. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm. "May I have a sparkling water? Please." Olivia didn't stop. "In a moment," she muttered. Her tone clipped, before turning her full attention back to another passenger. Dominic lowered his hand, exhaled slowly, and wrote another note in his notebook. It was the kind of discrimination that rarely screamed. Instead, it whispered, but those whispers piled up, one after another, until they became deafening. The passengers around him began to notice. Michael Anderson leaned slightly toward Dominic and whispered, "Did she just skip you?" Dominic gave a faint smile. "Happens more often than people realize." Michael frowned. "That's not right." Dominic didn't respond. His pen moved steadily across the page: boarding, lack of greeting, pre-flight service, ignored, witness present. The subtle neglect continued as the flight attendants prepared for takeoff. Kevin Brooks, the tall, nervous-looking junior attendant, passed by Dominic's seat 3 times without offering to stow his jacket or ask about his comfort. Yet every white passenger nearby received polite inquiries and assistance. Dominic remained still, his posture composed, though inside a familiar mix of emotions stirred. A quiet ache, a weary frustration, and beneath it all, a deep, restrained fire. He had seen this script before. He had lived it since he was a child, and every time it happened, it was as if someone was trying to remind him that he didn't belong, but they didn't know who he was. 2 hours later, the tension in the cabin reached its breaking point. Dominic, having pressed the call button 3 times without response, overheard Rachel whispering to Kevin near the galley. "I don't know how he got a seat up here," she muttered, her tone sharp. "Probably some last-minute upgrade. They always think they deserve special treatment." Kevin gave a nervous laugh. "Should I check his boarding pass again?" Rachel smirked. "Ignore him for now. Focus on the passengers who actually belong in first class." The words pierced through the hum of the cabin and landed squarely in Dominic's chest. He closed his notebook, rose slowly from his seat, and walked toward them. His steps were steady, measured. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice carrying just enough to silence the immediate area. Rachel and Kevin turned sharply, faces pale. Dominic looked at them calmly. "I couldn't help overhearing," he said. "I'd like to remind you that all passengers deserve equal respect, regardless of what they look like." Rachel's face flushed. "Sir, I assure you, we treat all our passengers with the utmost." "I've been seated here for 2 hours," Dominic interrupted, his voice still calm. "I've been denied a pre-flight beverage. My call button has been ignored. My meal request was lost. Meanwhile, every white passenger around me has been treated with warmth and care." Kevin shifted uncomfortably. Olivia, now standing nearby, stepped forward with forced patience. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass again? Just to confirm you're in the right cabin." The words hung heavy in the air. Other passengers glanced over. Some shook their heads. Dominic looked at her evenly. "This is the 3rd time you've asked for it. My boarding pass hasn't changed." "What has changed," he said slowly, "is my patience for discriminatory treatment." Rachel crossed her arms. "Sir, if you continue disrupting the flight, we'll have to involve the captain." Dominic straightened his shoulders, his voice even but firm. "Please do. And while you're at it, I'd like the full names and employee IDs of every crew member on duty." The surrounding passengers murmured in support. Michael Anderson stood, his voice carrying. "I've been watching this the entire flight. They've repeatedly ignored him. It's blatant, and it's wrong. Rachel's composure cracked. Sir, I don't know who you think you are, but you need to know your place. The cabin fell silent. Every eye turned toward Dominic. He looked at Rachel steadily, his expression calm, though his heart hammered inside his chest. He leaned forward slightly, his voice soft, but cutting through the silence like steel. You'll know exactly who I am when we land. The words lingered in the air, heavy with promise. Rachel blinked, her confidence faltering for the first time. Dominic turned, walked back to his seat, and opened his notebook again. His pen scratched across the page with deliberate calm. Even as the storm inside him grew, what the crew didn't know, what none of them realized, was that the quiet man in seat 2A was not just another passenger. He was their CEO. And the lesson they were about to learn would shake the entire airline. Dominic Carter had not been born into comfort. Long before the tailored suits, before the corner office overlooking city skylines, before passengers whispered his name as the head of one of the nation's most talked-about airlines, there was only struggle. His story began in the worn-out streets of Eastwood, a neighborhood on the south side of Detroit where opportunity rarely knocked and dreams often evaporated under the weight of survival. The apartment where Dominic grew up was small, a 2-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor of a crumbling brick building. The paint peeled from the walls, the radiators clanged in winter, and the summer heat made the place feel like an oven. Yet to Dominic, it was home, because of the woman who made sure there was always warmth in their lives, even when the bills stacked higher than the kitchen table. His mother, Lorraine Carter, worked as a custodian at St. Vincent's Hospital. She scrubbed floors, polished windows, and emptied trash cans long after her feet had gone numb inside thin-soled shoes. Every night, she returned home with aching hands, but eyes full of fire. She carried in the smell of disinfectant and determination. She would drop her keys on the counter, kiss Dominic's forehead, and tell him the same thing she had said since he was old enough to understand words. Baby, education is the one thing they can't take from you. Hold on to it, no matter what. Dominic listened. At the small kitchen table, under the dim yellow light of a second-hand lamp, he studied until his eyelids fought him. His mother's voice would drift from the couch as she dozed off. Exhausted from her shift, he would whisper the words from his textbooks aloud, partly to memorize, partly to remind himself that his mind was his way out. While other kids on his block battled with the pull of gangs or the temptation of fast money, Dominic turned the pages of books about aviation, engineering, and business strategy. He had fallen in love with airplanes when he was 10. On Saturdays, if Lorraine could spare the bus fare, they would ride out to a hill near the airport's perimeter fence. Dominic would press his face against the chain link as massive jets roared above them, landing gear unfolding like mechanical wings of destiny. Each time, he whispered to himself, "One day, I'll be up there, not just flying, leading." But the world did not make it easy. School was its own battlefield. Dominic was often the only black student in his advanced classes. Teachers doubted his placement, classmates asked if he was lost, and counselors gently suggested that trade school might be a safer, more realistic option than chasing degrees in engineering or business. Every time he heard the word realistic, he felt a knot tighten in his chest. It was never about his grades, which were excellent. It was about their disbelief that someone like him could belong at the top. That disbelief might have broken another boy, but Dominic was built differently. The nights of hearing his mother's voice in his ear, telling him that knowledge was untouchable, created a steel backbone. The long hours of watching her push a mop with dignity made him understand that dignity did not come from titles or paychecks, but from how one carried themselves in the face of struggle. At 17, Dominic's determination bore fruit. Letters arrived in thin envelopes and thick ones. He was rejected from some schools he expected that, but when he tore open the envelope from Northbridge University, one of the nation's top institutions for both engineering and business, his heart nearly stopped. Full scholarship, room and board, recognition of his academic excellence. He ran the letter across the living room to his mother, who was folding laundry, her back aching after another double shift. Lorraine read the words once, then again, then a third time before her knees buckled and she sat heavily on the couch. Tears streamed down her face, and she laughed through them. "You did it, baby. You're going to build wings for yourself." At Northbridge, Dominic encountered a new level of challenge. The classrooms were filled with students from wealthy suburbs, children of executives and politicians, students who drove cars that cost more than his childhood apartment. He arrived with 2 suitcases, both second-hand, and the weight of 1,000 doubts pressed against his shoulders. But he fought those doubts with relentless discipline. He sat in the front row, took meticulous notes, asked sharp questions. Professors quickly realized he was not there to fill a quota, he was there to excel. And excel he did. He double majored in aerospace engineering and business administration, graduating near the top of his class. Yet even then, he could not escape the silent barriers. When he began interviewing with airlines after graduation, Dominic wore the same carefully pressed navy suit to every meeting. He carried his resume in a leather folder, his handshake firm, his voice steady. But in waiting rooms across the industry, he experienced the same pattern. Receptionists' eyebrows lifted when they matched his name to his face. Interviewers smiled thinly, then asked if he was certain he had applied for the right program. 38 times. He walked out of corporate lobbies with the same hollow ache. 38 times. He was told without words that he did not look like someone who belonged in their boardroom. One night, after his 38th rejection, Dominic sat in his small apartment, staring at the ceiling. The doubt crept in, whispering that maybe they were right. Maybe his mother's dream was too heavy for him to carry. He could hear the laughter of other young professionals outside, the world moving forward while he stood still. For a brief moment, he considered giving up. But then he thought of Lorraine's hands, raw from chemicals, gripping his face as she told him, "Education is the one thing they can't take from you." He thought of the jets roaring above that chain-link fence when he was 10, the promise he whispered to himself. The fire inside him reignited. It was just a week later that fate intervened. At a networking event for young professionals, Dominic met Malcolm Turner, a man who had already carved his name into aviation history as the first black senior executive at a major airline back in the 1980s. Turner was tall, with a salt-and-pepper beard and a presence that radiated both authority and compassion. They spoke for hours that night. Dominic shared his rejections, his frustrations, his relentless drive. Turner listened intently, then smiled with a knowing sadness. "Son, I've sat in those same lobbies. I've seen those same looks. The difference is, I know what it feels like to break through, and I see that fire in you." Turner offered him a job on the spot, not as charity, but as investment. "You remind me of myself," he said, "and the world needs more of us in the cockpit and the boardroom." That moment became the pivot point of Dominic's life. Under Turner's mentorship, he not only gained opportunity, but also a mirror of what was possible. Turner taught him that leadership meant carrying the weight of more than your own career. It meant carrying the hopes of everyone who had been told they did not belong. Years later, when Dominic would find himself seated in 2A of a first-class cabin, ignored and dismissed by the very people employed to serve with dignity, those memories would come rushing back. The lessons of Lorraine's sacrifice, the sting of rejection, the fire of Turner's mentorship, each would shape how he responded. He would not explode in rage. He would not crumble into silence. He would do what he had always done: endure, record, wait for the right moment, then rise with measured strength. Because Dominic Carter had learned resilience in its purest form. And resilience, he knew, was the sharpest weapon against a world that kept trying to tell him to know his place. Dominic Carter stepped into the offices of Turner Aviation with a mixture of awe and nervous energy. The building itself was unassuming from the outside, a modest concrete structure with tinted windows that reflected the midday sun. Inside, however, it was alive with a quiet intensity. Flight schedules were pinned on whiteboards, screens displayed real-time departures and arrivals, and a team of diverse professionals moved with precise purpose, each step carrying a responsibility that seemed almost sacred. Malcolm Turner greeted him at the entrance with a warm smile and an outstretched hand. His presence was commanding but never overbearing, like the quiet authority of a seasoned pilot who had seen every storm and knew exactly how to navigate it. "Dominic, welcome," Turner said. "You've earned this. Let's get to work." Dominic's hands were clammy, not from fear, but from anticipation. He had spent years imagining what this moment might feel like, how he would walk into a room and finally belong. And yet reality carried a gravity he had not anticipated. Turner led him through the office, introducing him to staff, engineers, and administrative personnel. Each handshake and nod seemed to echo an unspoken acknowledgement this young man had fought to arrive at this moment. And now he was here to learn not just to fly planes, but to lead people. In the first weeks, Turner immersed Dominic in the nuances of airline operations. From fleet management to customer experience protocols, he taught him the art of decision-making under pressure, the delicate balance between safety, efficiency, and human empathy. Dominic absorbed every word, every gesture, every insight as if his life depended on it, which in a way it did. Yet even in this nurturing environment, Dominic could not escape the persistent whisper of self-doubt. Each time he presented a plan to the senior team or made a strategic recommendation, a shadow of hesitation crept in. Was he articulate enough? Was he convincing enough? Did they see him as capable, or merely as a token of diversity? He wrestled with these thoughts quietly, often lying awake at night, the ceiling of his apartment reflecting the city lights as he turned over each scenario in his mind. Turner noticed these moments of internal struggle. One afternoon, after Dominic had stayed late reviewing flight crew schedules, Turner found him staring at a whiteboard filled with notes. "You're carrying too much on your own," Turner said softly. "Resilience is about endurance. Yes, but it is also about knowing when to lean on those around you. Leadership is not just strength, it's connection." Dominic looked up, a flicker of vulnerability passing across his features. I want to make sure I get it right. I want to prove that I belong," he admitted. Turner nodded, his eyes reflecting years of similar battles. "You do belong. The challenge is not proving it to others. The challenge is proving it to yourself. You have the skills, the mind, and the heart. Trust them. Trust yourself." These conversations became a ritual. Turner would meet Dominic twice a week, often over coffee in the small kitchen at the back of the office. They would talk about everything from leadership philosophies to personal values. Turner shared stories of discrimination he had faced, of doors slammed in his face, of times he had been underestimated because of his skin color. And Dominic listened. Learning that adversity did not define a person's limits, it revealed their capacity to rise above. One day, Turner handed Dominic a file thicker than any he had seen before. It contained records of an airline crisis from the previous year, including complaints from passengers, internal memos, and staff interviews. Turner leaned back in his chair. "I want you to go through this and develop a plan. You're going to be responsible for redesigning our passenger interaction protocols. You need to anticipate problems before they occur, and you need to think beyond standard procedures. Innovation and empathy must coexist." Dominic felt a surge of both excitement and pressure. This was more responsibility than he had ever been entrusted with. For days, he analyzed every case, cross-referenced procedures, and conducted his own interviews with staff. He saw patterns of bias, moments where crew members failed to recognize subtle passenger distress, and opportunities for improvement that could enhance both safety and satisfaction. In those long hours, Dominic also reflected on his own experiences with discrimination. Memories from his childhood, the moments of doubt in school, the repeated rejections from airlines, all converged with the lessons Turner had imparted. He realized that he could use these insights not only to improve operational efficiency, but also to create a culture where respect and fairness were non-negotiable. The final presentation day arrived, and Dominic felt a knot in his stomach as he entered the conference room. Turner gave him a reassuring nod. "Show them what you've got," he said simply. Dominic began to speak, his voice calm but firm. He outlined his analysis, presented his recommendations, and proposed new protocols emphasizing accountability, transparency, and empathy. As he spoke, he noticed heads nodding, eyes lighting up with approval. Questions came, challenges were raised, and Dominic responded with clarity, grounding his arguments in both data and human experience. By the end of the session, the room erupted in applause. Turner smiled proudly, and Dominic felt a deep, satisfying sense of belonging he had rarely experienced. Yet even in triumph, Dominic remained introspective. He knew the world beyond Turner Aviation would not always be as understanding or welcoming. The airport terminals, the crowded gates, the cabin crews. These were spaces where biases lingered and patience could wear thin. He realized that leadership was not a shield against injustice, but a tool to confront it, carefully, deliberately, with both courage and tact. Over time, Dominic became a respected figure within Turner Aviation. Staff sought his advice. Junior employees gravitated toward him for mentorship, and even the skeptical senior managers recognized his insight and vision. Yet he never forgot the internal battles that had shaped him. Every success carried a reminder that resilience required constant nurturing, and empathy required conscious effort. One late evening, as he left the office, Dominic stood outside the building and looked up at the night sky. The stars shimmered above, distant and eternal, and in that moment he thought of Lorraine, of the hill near the Detroit airport, of the jets roaring overhead when he was 10 years old. All of it the struggle, the guidance, the victories, the doubts had led him here, and he knew that the most significant tests, the moments that would truly define his character, were still ahead, because one day, very soon, Dominic Carter would be face to face with injustice not in the textbooks, not in training scenarios, but at 30,000 feet, in the confined space of an airplane cabin, where decisions carried immediate consequences and every action could ripple across lives. And when that day came, He would rely on everything he had learned from his mother, from Turner, and from his own relentless determination. He would act not with anger, but with purpose, not with impulsive reaction, but with measured, unyielding resolve. The seeds of resilience had taken root deeply, and they would bloom in the most unexpected and powerful ways. The first flight under Dominic's direct supervision started like any other. Passengers boarded quietly, some glancing at the uniformed crew, others absorbed in their devices, unaware of the subtle tension that hovered beneath the polished veneer of the cabin. Dominic stood near the front of the plane, observing the crew as they completed their pre-flight checks. His mind ran through the protocols he had meticulously designed over the past weeks, ensuring that every interaction, every step, was calibrated to minimize errors and maximize empathy. Rachel Hayes, the lead flight attendant, approached him with a clipboard in hand, her expression neutral but professional. "Everything looks good. Dominic, crew is ready. Passengers are boarding. ETA for departure is on schedule." Dominic nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. This was the moment where theory met reality. "Thank you, Rachel. Keep me posted if anything unusual comes up." As the plane reached cruising altitude, the hum of engines and the occasional announcement from the cockpit created a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. Dominic sat back in his jump seat, reviewing passenger manifests and internal communications. The cabin seemed calm, the kind of serene environment that allowed him a rare moment of reflection. And then it began. A dispute erupted in row 12. A young black man, impeccably dressed, had been asked by Rachel to adjust his seating arrangement to accommodate a late boarding passenger, a white businessman who claimed he had a preferred seat. Dominic's attention snapped to the scene immediately. The young man's eyes were firm but tired, his jaw clenched in frustration, and Rachel's posture carried the awkward tension of someone unsure how far she could enforce protocol. Dominic rose from his seat and approached slowly, careful not to escalate the situation. He observed the interaction with the patience he had cultivated under Turner's mentorship. His mind raced through the options, enforce the rules strictly, advocate for fairness, or find a solution that preserved dignity and authority. "Excuse me," Dominic said calmly, addressing both passengers. "I'm Dominic Carter. I oversee operations today. Can we step over here for a moment?" He gestured toward the space near the emergency exit row, offering a neutral ground for discussion. The young man's eyes softened slightly, a flicker of hope mingled with skepticism. "I just don't understand why I need to move," he said quietly. "I booked this seat weeks ago. It's my space." Dominic nodded, acknowledging the validity of his complaint. "I understand. And you're right. Your booking should be respected. Let's find a solution that works for everyone," the white businessman interjected, his tone sharp. "I paid for this seat. I have a meeting in an hour. Can't you just ask him to move? That's the easiest solution." Dominic's gaze was steady, his voice calm but firm. "Sir, I understand your urgency, but fairness is non-negotiable. We cannot ask one passenger to give up their seat simply because another passenger believes they are more entitled. Let's explore alternatives." As the discussion continued, Dominic noticed the subtle cues among the crew. Kevin Brooks, a junior flight attendant, glanced nervously at him, uncertain whether he should intervene. Olivia Moore shifted her weight, sensing the tension but hesitant to speak. Dominic realized that this was more than a seating dispute. It was a test of the new protocols, a microcosm of the very challenges he had prepared for in Turner's office. He calmly suggested offering the white businessman an upgrade to first class. ensuring that both passengers were satisfied while maintaining the principle of fairness. Rachel and Kevin executed the plan smoothly, presenting the upgrade with courtesy and professionalism. The white businessman accepted, though his relief was tinged with mild embarrassment. The young man remained in his original seat, his posture relaxing, the tension in his shoulders dissipating. Dominic returned to his jump seat, exhaling slowly. He knew that the incident would be remembered by the crew, by the passengers, and by himself. The delicate balance of authority, empathy, and decisiveness had been maintained, but he also knew that it was only the beginning. The real test would come when such decisions were scrutinized not by a calm observation, but by the court of public opinion, where emotions ran wild and perception often overshadowed reality. Later, as the plane cruised above the clouds, Dominic reflected on the incident. He could feel the subtle echoes of discrimination, not overt but insidious, threading through the cabin environment. It was a reminder that the work he was doing was not just about efficiency or protocol. It was about changing mindsets, about creating spaces where fairness and respect were the default, not exceptions. He also noticed his own internal reaction, a flicker of anger he quickly tempered. Years of experience, mentorship, and self-reflection taught him that acting out of emotion could escalate situations unnecessarily. Instead, he focused on what Turner had taught him: controlled authority, guided by empathy and principle. As the flight continued, Dominic made mental notes for post-flight debriefings. He would meet with Rachel and Kevin, discussing what went well and what could be improved. He would also review the boarding process and passenger communication protocols, identifying small changes that could prevent similar disputes in the future. Every observation, every interaction was data, a tool to refine the system and strengthen the crew's confidence in handling conflict. Yet, despite his composed exterior, Dominic wrestled with an inner storm. The experience rekindled memories of his own childhood encounters with prejudice, of the times he had been judged unfairly based on appearances, and of the subtle ways authority had sometimes sided with those who held privilege. It was a weight he carried silently, a fuel for both empathy and determination. By the time the plane began its descent, Dominic felt the familiar mix of exhaustion and accomplishment. The incident in row 12 had been resolved peacefully, the passengers satisfied, the crew confident, but he knew the battle was far from over. These moments were early indicators of the challenges that awaited him at 30,000 feet and beyond. When the plane landed smoothly and passengers disembarked, Dominic lingered near the gate, watching the crew interact with the passengers. He noticed Kevin's quiet satisfaction, Olivia's subtle pride, and Rachel's composed smile. It was in these moments he realized that real change began not in grand gestures, but in the small, consistent choices to act with fairness and integrity. Dominic's mind also turned to the broader implications. He considered how the incident could have been amplified on social media, how public perception could distort reality, and how critical it was to have a framework for accountability and transparency. Turner's lessons echoed in his mind. Leadership was about foresight as much as action, about preparing for challenges that had not yet materialized. As the crew returned to their stations to complete post-flight duties, Dominic felt a quiet sense of readiness. He knew that the first signs of conflict were inevitable in any environment, especially one as diverse and dynamic as an airplane cabin. The question was not whether conflicts would arise, but whether they could be navigated with clarity, fairness, and empathy. He also recognized the subtle internal transformations that these moments induced. Each confrontation, each decision, strengthened his resolve, sharpened his judgment, and reinforced his commitment to principles that mattered. Dominic understood that true leadership was not defined by smooth operations alone, but by the courage to uphold justice, even when it was uncomfortable or inconvenient. As he walked toward the rear of the plane to debrief with the crew, Dominic felt the familiar steadiness of purpose. The real work was beginning, and he was ready to face conflict, ready to guide his team, and ready to ensure that fairness, dignity, and respect remained at the core of every decision, every interaction, every flight. After the initial seating dispute, the cabin seemed to settle, a deceptive calm that often precedes more intense moments. Dominic remained in his jump seat, observing quietly, his senses attuned to the smallest shifts in atmosphere. He understood that even minor disturbances could ripple through a plane full of diverse passengers, and he was determined to prevent escalation before it became unmanageable. Rachel Hayes walked past him, placing a reassuring hand on Kevin Brooks' shoulder. "You did well," she said softly, "but I can feel it. There's more tension than just that seating issue." Kevin nodded, his expression tight. "Yeah, I think some passengers are already on edge. It's like waiting for a spark in a powder keg." Dominic's gaze swept across the cabin. He noticed subtle signs: a mother trying to soothe her restless toddler, two teenagers whispering sharply at each other, a group of businessmen exchanging curt nods and occasional glare. Each passenger's body language told a story, and he absorbed it all without judgment, cataloging potential flashpoints. About 30 minutes into the flight, the first real escalation began. A man in row 17, middle-aged with a short temper and a loud voice, began complaining about the beverage service. His frustration grew as the flight attendants navigated around his seat, trying to offer alternatives while balancing the needs of other passengers. Dominic walked over calmly. "Sir, I understand that this has been frustrating," he said, projecting a tone both firm and empathetic. "We are working to accommodate everyone as best as we can. May I suggest an alternative that might resolve this quickly?" The man's eyes narrowed, but he did not shout, which Dominic took as a sign of partial control. "I don't want an alternative. I want exactly what I asked for. Why is it so hard to get what I want on a flight that's supposed to be smooth?" Dominic nodded, acknowledging his complaint while maintaining authority. "I hear you. I also want every passenger to have the experience they paid for. Let's find a solution that meets your expectations without affecting others. We can resolve this quickly." Meanwhile, Rachel and Kevin worked discreetly with the other passengers, keeping the tension from spreading. Olivia Moore moved down the aisle, quietly checking in with passengers who seemed anxious or irritated, providing small gestures of reassurance. Dominic noticed how their actions mirrored his own philosophy. Subtle leadership, guided by empathy, often prevented small issues from becoming crises. Despite their efforts, the atmosphere grew denser. Dominic sensed the undercurrent of prejudice and entitlement in the cabin. The young black passenger from row 12, seated now in his original spot, appeared uneasy once again, sensing the subtle glances and whispers. Dominic's internal alarm went off. He knew that microaggressions, even unspoken, could erode the sense of fairness he worked to uphold. He walked back to row 12, sitting briefly beside the young man. "How are you feeling?" he asked, speaking softly to avoid drawing attention. The young man looked at him, a mix of gratitude and fatigue in his eyes. "I appreciate you stepping in," he said quietly. "It's just, people can be so quick to judge. I try to stay calm, but it's exhausting sometimes." Dominic nodded, placing a reassuring hand on his knee. "I understand. It's not easy. But your dignity is important. Never let anyone make you feel like it isn't. The young man offered a small, genuine smile. Dominic could feel the weight of the moment, not just for him, but for everyone on the plane witnessing fairness in action, whether consciously or subconsciously. Meanwhile, the white businessman from the previous conflict, Michael Anderson, noticed the interaction. He leaned toward Dominic and said quietly, "I have to say, I admire how you handle this. It's rare." Dominic gave a faint nod, appreciating the acknowledgement while remaining focused on the broader situation. "Thank you. It's about ensuring everyone is treated with respect and fairness." That's the only sustainable approach. Tensions escalated again as another dispute erupted near the emergency exit row. Two passengers, one elderly and one a young professional, argued over overhead bin space. Dominic moved to mediate, calmly assessing the situation. He listened to both sides, noting their emotional states, their personal stakes, and the potential impact on nearby passengers. "I understand both of your concerns," Dominic said evenly. "We have limited overhead space, but we can find a solution. Let's see if we can redistribute some items to create room for both of you." The elderly passenger grumbled, but allowed Dominic to guide him, while the younger professional adjusted his luggage without further protest. Again, the conflict was resolved without confrontation, but Dominic recognized the pattern. Small incidents could easily accumulate, creating a compounded stress in the cabin. Throughout these episodes, Dominic's internal dialogue was intense. He reflected on the nature of authority, fairness, and perception. Was he doing enough to maintain balance? Or were these minor victories masking deeper issues? Could microaggressions or unspoken biases undermine the work he was doing? He acknowledged a twinge of doubt, a moment of vulnerability, but he used it to fuel careful observation and measured action. Back at the front, Rachel and Kevin took brief moments to regroup. Dominic recognized their subtle exhaustion, the kind that comes from constant vigilance and high-stakes responsibility. "Take a breath," he said softly. "You're doing well. Keep observing, keep supporting each other, and trust your instincts." Olivia, meanwhile, moved toward the rear, checking on passengers who had not yet interacted with the crew. Her calm, attentive manner reminded Dominic that leadership was not just about decisions, but about presence, being seen, being available, being human. As the flight progressed, Dominic began to notice a more insidious type of tension. Whispered comments, subtle side glances, and minor complaints suggested that not all passengers were equally comfortable with the enforced fairness. Some seemed resentful that one individual had not been asked to move, while others were quietly relieved. Dominic understood that social dynamics were at play beyond mere protocol. He took a moment in the jump seat to reflect, closing his eyes briefly as the plane hummed steadily through the clouds. The challenge was no longer logistical. It was psychological, social, and deeply human. Every choice he made had consequences, and the ripple effects of fairness and authority extended far beyond the immediate resolution of disputes. Dominic recognized the value of mindfulness in these moments. By staying present, attentive, and empathetic, he could mitigate not just overt conflicts, but the subtler, more corrosive undercurrents of bias and entitlement. Each small victory, each passenger reassured, strengthened the cabin's sense of equilibrium, yet he remained alert. Dominic knew that conflict could resurface at any moment, and he had to be prepared for escalation. His mind cycled through hypothetical scenarios, disagreements, emotional outbursts, microaggressions, and even possible medical emergencies. Each scenario required a delicate balance of authority, empathy, and strategic thinking. By mid-flight, Dominic had achieved something subtle but powerful. The crew functioned as a cohesive unit. Passengers were aware, but mostly at ease, and he had maintained a framework of fairness without confrontation. The tension had not disappeared entirely, but it had been managed, and that was a victory in itself. As he observed the cabin one last time before initiating the pre-landing procedures, Dominic felt a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. He knew that these early episodes of tension were not failures, but opportunities to refine leadership, to teach his crew resilience, and to uphold principles that mattered. He also recognized the personal stakes. Each conflict, each resolution, deepened his understanding of human behavior and strengthened his own character. The young man in row 12, the passengers at the overhead bins, even the demanding businessman, they were all part of a larger tapestry that tested fairness, empathy, and authority. Dominic understood that the cabin was more than a workplace. It was a microcosm of society, a space where justice, respect, and empathy could either flourish or fail. The responsibility weighed on him, but it also motivated him to act decisively, thoughtfully, and with unwavering integrity. By the time the descent began, Dominic had prepared not just for landing, but for reflection. He would debrief with the crew, evaluate the incidents, and consider adjustments to protocols and training. Every moment, every observation, was a chance to improve, to strengthen the team, and to uphold the principles that guided him. As the wheels touched the tarmac, Dominic felt the quiet pride of a mission partially accomplished. The cabin was calm, the crew confident, and the passengers, for the most part, satisfied. Yet he knew the deeper work was ongoing, addressing biases, managing perceptions, and sustaining fairness in a world that often resisted it. The cabin had settled into a rhythm, a delicate balance that Dominic had worked hard to maintain. The passengers seemed relaxed, some reading, others dozing lightly, and a few engaged in quiet conversation. Dominic leaned back in his jump seat, observing with a careful calm, sensing that even small changes could ripple quickly through the confined space. Rachel walked down the aisle with a tray of beverages, her movements graceful and reassuring. She exchanged smiles with passengers, subtly reinforcing a sense of safety and order. Kevin trailed slightly behind, ready to assist, while Olivia moved to check on those seated near the wings, where turbulence often felt more pronounced. The tranquility shattered abruptly when a loud, distressed cry erupted from row 21. Dominic's head snapped toward the sound. A woman, mid-30s, pale and shaking, was gripping the armrests as though her life depended on it. The surrounding passengers had frozen, startled by the intensity of her fear. Dominic quickly rose, his calm authority cutting through the panic in the air. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice steady but commanding enough to gain immediate attention. "She's having a panic attack," Rachel responded, her own voice firm but soothing as she approached the distressed woman. Dominic moved closer, kneeling slightly to meet her eyes without overwhelming her. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe. We're right here with you. Can you tell me what you're feeling?" The woman gasped, her words fragmented. I can't breathe. The plane. I feel like it's falling. I can't. Tears streamed down her face, and Dominic felt the weight of the moment. Panic attacks, he knew, were invisible storms, and the fear they unleashed could be just as dangerous as a physical threat if not handled with care. Rachel handed Dominic a bottle of water, which he offered with steady hands. "Take a sip, slowly," he instructed. "Breathe with me, in and out. We're here, and you're safe." The woman's body trembled violently, but she followed his lead, drawing slow, measured breaths as Dominic counted aloud. Olivia knelt nearby, quietly holding the woman's hand, a silent gesture of support that reinforced Dominic's words. Kevin addressed the nearby passengers, maintaining order while also explaining in calm tones what was happening. "She's having a medical episode. Please give her space and remain seated. We're handling it." Dominic observed the other passengers closely. Their reactions varied. Some looked worried and empathetic, while others were irritated by the delay. He noted every expression, every whisper, understanding that how the situation unfolded would set the tone for the remainder of the flight. Authority alone was not enough. Empathy had to be visible and genuine. As the woman's breathing began to stabilize, Dominic allowed himself a brief internal exhale. He knew that recovery from a panic attack required more than immediate intervention. The psychological impact lingered, and he had to ensure the passenger felt safe for the duration of the flight. He spoke gently. "You're doing well. We'll remain with you until you feel ready to continue. No rush, no judgment. Just take your time." The woman's voice came out trembling, but clearer. "Thank you. I was so scared. I thought I was going to." She trailed off, clinging to the water bottle like a lifeline. Dominic nodded, acknowledging her fear without letting it dominate the cabin. "It's natural to feel scared. You're brave for facing it and allowing us to help. That's important." Meanwhile, Michael Anderson, the businessman from earlier, watched the scene quietly. Dominic noticed his subtle shift something between curiosity and unease. The man had been assertive and critical in previous interactions, but here he seemed to witness the vulnerability of another human being, unfiltered and raw. Dominic wondered how this would shape his perspective for the rest of the flight. The flight continued, yet Dominic sensed the psychological atmosphere had shifted. The panic attack, while contained, reminded everyone that the enclosed space of an aircraft amplified emotions. Tensions that might remain minor elsewhere could intensify in this setting. He remained vigilant, scanning for signs of unrest, subtly redirecting attention and energy where needed. At this moment, the young black passenger, Marcus Ellison, looked toward Dominic with a mix of curiosity and relief. He had been quiet for much of the flight, absorbing the crew's interventions and observing the unfolding dynamics. Dominic offered a brief nod and a reassuring smile, silently acknowledging Marcus's awareness of fairness and empathy in action. Rachel and Kevin worked seamlessly with Dominic to maintain calm. Kevin discreetly handed the distressed woman a blanket and adjusted her seating slightly for comfort. Rachel spoke softly, guiding her through relaxation techniques and reminding her of safety measures. Olivia, always attentive, remained nearby, quietly offering water and gentle encouragement. Dominic's mind, however, could not rest entirely. He reflected on the nature of human behavior in confined spaces. Fear, stress, and perception of injustice could transform minor incidents into major crises if not managed with precision. Every gesture, every word mattered. Every passenger interaction became part of a larger narrative about fairness, authority, and empathy. As the initial panic subsided, Dominic walked slowly down the aisle, offering brief reassurances to others who had witnessed the event. "Everything is under control," he said gently. "Thank you for your patience. We're committed to ensuring everyone's safety and comfort." Passengers nodded, some with relief, others with lingering curiosity. Dominic understood that this subtle acknowledgement reinforced trust in the crew's capabilities. By being visible, calm, and empathetic, he was shaping not only immediate outcomes, but the broader perception of fairness and authority. Minutes passed, and the cabin returned to a tentative equilibrium. Dominic allowed himself to step back and breathe. He reviewed the situation internally. The intervention had prevented escalation, reassured the passenger, and maintained order among observers. Yet he knew that vigilance had to remain constant. He reflected on his own emotional response as well. The intensity of another person's fear resonated deeply, reminding him of past experiences where he had witnessed helplessness and vulnerability. He recognized the importance of emotional grounding, both for his own well-being and for the clarity needed in leadership. By mid-flight, Dominic had reestablished a rhythm. He continued to monitor subtle cues, the slight tension in a passenger's posture, a murmured comment between seats, a faint expression of discomfort. These observations were essential. The cumulative effect of minor stresses could influence behavior in unexpected ways. At one point, Dominic noticed Lucas Porter, the young professional involved in the earlier bin dispute, glancing nervously toward the rear of the cabin. Dominic approached discreetly. "Is everything all right?" he asked. Lucas hesitated, then admitted quietly, "I guess I didn't realize how tense everything feels now." Seeing her panic, it made me aware of how fragile this environment is. Dominic nodded, appreciating the honesty. "It's true. The cabin can amplify emotions, and that's why our focus is on fairness and support. Awareness is part of maintaining balance." Rachel, Kevin, and Olivia converged with Dominic near the rear, forming a subtle but visible circle of reassurance and competence. The crew's presence was calm but firm, guiding the cabin through the remainder of the flight with measured attention. Dominic allowed a quiet smile as he observed Marcus reading quietly, now more at ease. The young man's resilience, combined with the crew's intervention, reflected the potential for positive outcomes even in high-stress situations. Dominic understood that leadership was not about imposing control, but about cultivating trust and empathy, visible in every gesture and word. The remainder of the flight passed without further incidents, but Dominic remained vigilant. He had learned that in a confined space like an aircraft, unpredictability was constant, and preparedness meant staying attuned to both overt and subtle signs of disruption. By the time the plane began its descent, the cabin atmosphere had returned to a state of cautious calm. Dominic reflected on the lessons of the day. Leadership in moments of disruption required empathy, attentiveness, and unwavering presence. He also recognized the value of the crew's seamless coordination, reinforcing that collective effort and trust were essential to maintaining equilibrium. As the wheels touched the runway, Dominic felt a sense of measured accomplishment. The panic attack had been managed, tensions mitigated, and passengers reassured. Yet he knew the deeper challenge persisted: sustaining fairness, empathy, and authority in an environment where stress and perception could shift in an instant. The flight had regained a sense of cautious calm, yet Dominic Carter could feel a subtle tension still lingering in the cabin. The panic attack incident had been resolved, but it left an undercurrent of unease among the passengers. Dominic had learned long ago that in a confined space like an aircraft, emotions were contagious, and any spark could ignite a full-blown conflict. He moved through the cabin with quiet vigilance, observing interactions and reading the mood like a careful strategist. Marcus Ellison, who had been quietly watching the crew's professionalism, now glanced toward the front of the cabin, where a new disturbance had begun to take shape. A man, middle-aged with a sharply pressed suit, was speaking in a tone that teetered between irritation and hostility. Dominic immediately recognized him from an earlier exchange near the overhead bins. It was Michael Anderson, the businessman who had challenged the crew's handling of luggage disputes. Michael had grown increasingly vocal, leaning over his seat to gesticulate at Kevin Brooks, who was calmly assisting other passengers. "This is unacceptable," he snapped. "I paid for this flight, and I expect service without these ridiculous delays. Why is everything so slow?" His voice rose, attracting glances from neighboring passengers, some sympathetic, others annoyed. Dominic moved toward Michael with measured steps, his calm presence a buffer against escalation. He knelt slightly to make eye contact, grounding the interaction. "Sir, I understand your frustration," he said evenly. "We are committed to providing safe and attentive service. Some delays are unavoidable, but we are handling every situation with care." Michael's eyes flashed with impatience. "Care? You call this care? My time is valuable. I don't need lectures. I need efficiency." Dominic maintained composure, recognizing that assertiveness without aggression was crucial. "We respect your time, sir. But in an environment like this, safety and fairness come first. That includes addressing any immediate needs of passengers who are experiencing distress." He gestured subtly toward the rear where the passenger who had a panic attack was now quietly resting. The reminder seemed to irritate Michael further. "This is a public flight. I don't care about some drama in the back. You're disrupting everyone's schedule." His tone carried an undercurrent of entitlement, a common pattern Dominic had encountered in leadership scenarios, especially in high-stress spaces like aircraft. Dominic took a deep breath. Centering himself, he knew that escalation would only harm both the crew and the passengers. "Sir, I assure you, we are maintaining order and ensuring everyone's comfort. Our priority is the well-being of all passengers, which sometimes requires addressing urgent situations as they arise. I appreciate your patience and understanding." Michael leaned back, muttering under his breath, clearly dissatisfied. Dominic observed him closely, noting the subtle shifts in body language, the tight clenching of his fists, the restless movement of his legs. It was clear that the conflict was far from resolved. Meanwhile, Lucas Porter, the young professional who had witnessed the panic attack earlier, spoke softly to his neighbor. "It's crazy how tense things get up here. Everyone's edge is just a moment away from snapping." His observation was quiet but resonant, a reminder that in confined spaces, collective tension could escalate quickly. Dominic decided to address the cabin more broadly, his voice gentle yet authoritative. "Everyone, I understand that small disruptions can feel stressful. We are doing everything possible to maintain comfort and safety. Please remember that cooperation and empathy make this journey smoother for all of us." His words seemed to settle some passengers, but Michael remained a simmering source of agitation. Dominic realized that the man's behavior might soon provoke others, potentially triggering arguments or emotional reactions. It was a delicate balance between de-escalation and maintaining authority. Rachel Hayes moved quietly to assist Dominic, her presence calm and reassuring. "Should I offer him a seat change?" she asked softly, knowing that minor adjustments could sometimes prevent larger confrontations. Dominic shook his head. "Not yet. Let's observe. If he escalates further, we will act. Right now, our focus is maintaining calm." Despite Dominic's efforts, the tension escalated subtly. A passenger a few rows back, frustrated by the ongoing delay and the visible discomfort of others, raised a question about the crew's handling of service. "Why are we waiting so long for drinks? This isn't right. We've been patient." Kevin Brooks approached with a measured tone, offering explanation and reassurance. "We're attending to a medical situation at the moment. Your patience is appreciated. Drinks and service will resume as soon as possible. Thank you for understanding." Some passengers nodded, reassured, while others remained visibly irritated. Dominic understood that the perception of fairness was critical. He walked down the aisle, acknowledging passengers individually with brief eye contact and subtle gestures, reinforcing that everyone's needs were being considered. Michael, however, refused to relent. He leaned forward again, this time addressing the cabin directly. "We're paying for a service. We deserve immediate attention. Why should one person's panic ruin it for everyone else?" His words, though harsh, echoed a common sentiment in shared spaces, highlighting the tension between individual entitlement and collective responsibility. Dominic felt a familiar surge of internal conflict. On one hand, he needed to assert authority firmly. On the other, he had to preserve empathy, ensuring that the passenger who had panicked was not stigmatized or dismissed. He weighed his response carefully, understanding that tone, word choice, and timing were crucial. He stepped closer to Michael, lowering his voice slightly to prevent further escalation. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but our priority is safety and fairness. Each passenger's needs are valid, and we cannot compromise anyone's well-being. We are managing all requests as efficiently as possible." Michael's jaw tightened, his face red with a mix of anger and embarrassment. He muttered, "This is ridiculous," and leaned back, crossing his arms in defiance. Dominic knew the confrontation was not fully resolved. The simmering resentment would need careful monitoring. Marcus Ellison, quietly observing from his seat, exchanged a glance with Dominic. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition of how leadership and fairness intersected in confined spaces. Dominic offered a small nod, silently conveying that awareness, integrity, and composure mattered more than immediate compliance. The cabin continued to buzz with low-level tension, a mixture of relief from the earlier panic attack and apprehension over Michael's ongoing dissatisfaction. Dominic focused on subtle de-escalation strategies, calm communication, attentive observation, and the reinforcement of fairness and empathy through small, visible actions. He allowed a brief moment of internal reflection. The flight had transformed into a microcosm of societal dynamics, where privilege, stress, and vulnerability collided. Leadership, he realized, was as much about moral courage as procedural authority. Every interaction, every choice, shaped the atmosphere and influenced behavior in profound ways. Olivia Moore moved quietly down the aisle, offering assistance to passengers needing reassurance. Her presence was a silent anchor, reinforcing Dominic's authority through visible care and competence. Rachel and Kevin remained strategically positioned, ready to intervene with subtle gestures that reinforced the crew's coordination and control. As the flight continued, Dominic noted Michael's occasional mutters but also observed subtle shifts. He seemed to be processing the crew's measured responses, though pride and impatience still held him back from genuine acknowledgement. Dominic understood that some conflicts could not be fully resolved mid-air. Patience and persistence were required. By the time dinner service resumed, the cabin had achieved a tenuous equilibrium. Michael remained distant and guarded, yet the immediate tension had been managed. Dominic allowed himself a quiet sense of accomplishment, knowing that the crew had maintained authority and empathy in the face of provocation. He reflected on the lessons of the encounter. Leadership was not about immediate compliance or dominance. It was about creating a space where fairness, respect, and empathy were visible, guiding behavior and maintaining order even when individuals resisted. The flight was a reminder that human behavior, when contained in close quarters, required constant awareness, sensitivity, and moral courage. The hum of the engines filled the cabin with a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm, yet beneath that mechanical calm, a tension crackled like static electricity. Dominic Carter remained vigilant, walking slowly through the rows, subtly observing each passenger while maintaining a composed presence. The earlier conflicts had settled into a fragile equilibrium, but Dominic knew from experience that calm on a plane could be deceptively thin. One spark, one misjudged word, and the balance could collapse entirely. Michael Anderson sat rigidly in his seat, arms crossed, his eyes darting toward the crew with suspicion and impatience. Dominic sensed that Michael's agitation was growing stronger, fueled by a sense of entitlement that ignored the shared reality of the cabin. Dominic paused near the middle of the plane, taking a deep breath, knowing that confrontation was imminent. He had learned that leadership was tested most sharply in moments like these, when tension threatened to spiral into chaos. He approached Michael calmly and lowered his voice so that only he and the nearby passengers could hear. "In key, sir, I understand that this situation has been frustrating. We are working to accommodate everyone as efficiently as possible while maintaining safety and fairness." Michael leaned forward slightly, his jaw tightening. "Safety is fine, but fairness? This is absurd. I'm paying for a service, and I expect it to be delivered promptly. I shouldn't have to wait because someone else is causing drama." His words dripped with impatience, a subtle mixture of indignation and challenge. Dominic held eye contact, unwavering yet empathetic. "We are committed to providing the service you paid for, but our first responsibility is to ensure that everyone on this flight is treated with care and respect. That includes responding to emergencies when they occur. Your cooperation allows us to maintain a safe environment for all passengers." Michael scoffed quietly, muttering under his breath, but Dominic could feel the tension in the cabin shift. Some passengers were glancing up, curious and wary. They were aware that a confrontation could escalate, and they were silently assessing Dominic's ability to maintain control. Rachel Hayes stepped in, her voice gentle but firm, walking beside Dominic. Perhaps offering a small accommodation, like a beverage or a seat adjustment, could diffuse the immediate tension, she suggested, aware that minor gestures often prevented major conflicts. Dominic nodded subtly, keeping his tone steady. "We can consider options, but only if it maintains fairness and safety. Let's proceed carefully." Meanwhile, Marcus Ellison, seated near the rear, observed the scene quietly. He had watched Dominic handle conflicts with remarkable calm and poise, but he also sensed the weight of responsibility pressing on him. In his mind, Marcus reflected on how leadership and empathy intersected in ways that were rarely appreciated until tested. He admired Dominic's ability to remain composed even when provoked, recognizing that moral courage often required patience more than immediate action. Lucas Porter, seated nearby, whispered to the passenger next to him, "It's tense up here, but Dominic seems to have a handle on it. Still, it feels like it could explode any second." The observation was quiet but accurate, capturing the fragile state of the cabin. Dominic took a deep breath, allowing himself a brief internal pause to reflect. He could feel the mental weight of being responsible not just for the physical safety of the passengers, but also for the emotional climate of the cabin. Every movement, every word, had the potential to shift the atmosphere. He was acutely aware of the invisible balance between authority and empathy. Michael shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing Dominic's calm resolve. His impatience was still present, but there was a subtle recognition that the crew would not yield to aggression. Dominic decided it was time for a slightly more assertive approach, still measured but firm. "Sir, we are ensuring that all passengers receive the service they are entitled to. I need you to understand that any attempt to disrupt this process will affect not only your experience, but the experience of everyone on this flight. We are asking for your cooperation to maintain a safe and fair environment." Michael's face reddened, but he did not immediately respond. The cabin fell into a hush, as if the passengers themselves were holding their collective breath. The tension was palpable, and Dominic sensed that this moment could define the remainder of the flight. At that precise moment, Olivia Moore quietly approached Michael with a calm smile. "Sir, may I offer you a choice of refreshments or a small comfort item? It may help you feel more settled while we manage the cabin." Her tone was soft, yet authoritative, carrying an implicit message of control and empathy. Michael hesitated, clearly weighing his pride against the appeal of a small accommodation. The hesitation itself was a turning point, a subtle shift in the power dynamics of the cabin. Dominic observed keenly, noting that even minor gestures of consideration could have disproportionate effects on tense interactions. Rachel Hayes whispered to Dominic, "He's listening now. Small adjustments can shift his behavior without confrontation." Dominic nodded inwardly, recognizing the tactical insight. He allowed Olivia to offer Michael a beverage and a small snack, observing carefully as the man's body language softened slightly. His arms uncrossed marginally, and the tension in his jaw relaxed. While he was far from friendly, the immediate threat of escalation had subsided. Meanwhile, the rest of the passengers watched the interaction with a mixture of relief and curiosity. Sophie Reynolds, who had experienced the earlier panic attack, quietly acknowledged Dominic with a small nod of gratitude, recognizing his leadership and care. Dominic moved back toward the center aisle, allowing the crew to continue their work. The cabin atmosphere remained charged but manageable. He knew that the turning point was not just about pacifying one passenger, but demonstrating to everyone that fairness, empathy, and authority could coexist in a high-stress environment. As Dominic reflected quietly, he felt a mixture of relief and continued vigilance. The tension had been diffused for the moment, but he was aware that the flight still held potential for conflict. His internal dialogue centered on the lessons of leadership under pressure. Authority was not about dominance, but about creating a sense of fairness and predictability. Empathy was not weakness, but a powerful tool for guiding behavior and maintaining order. Marcus Ellison, observing from his seat, quietly admired Dominic's approach. He recognized that the balance between assertiveness and compassion was delicate, and few could navigate it as effectively as Dominic. Lucas Porter also noted the subtle influence of small, well-timed gestures on the emotional climate of the cabin. Dominic allowed himself a brief internal sigh, acknowledging the weight of responsibility and the success of the moment. The turning point had been subtle but significant. He had prevented a potential escalation without compromising fairness or safety, demonstrating that leadership was as much about patience and observation as it was about direct action. The engines continued their steady hum, a soothing counterpoint to the tension that had pervaded the cabin. Dominic remained vigilant, moving through the rows and offering quiet reassurance where needed. The flight had become a microcosm of broader social dynamics, with entitlement, stress, empathy, and moral courage intersecting in real time. By the end of the segment, the immediate threat of confrontation had been diffused, but Dominic knew that vigilance was essential. Leadership required constant attention to both the visible and invisible dynamics of the environment. He reflected on the significance of empathy, moral courage, and composure as tools for maintaining order and fairness in the face of human complexity. The cabin settled into a tentative rhythm after the earlier standoff, but Dominic Carter could feel the undercurrents still swirling beneath the surface. Human emotions rarely stayed dormant for long, and in the confined, pressurized environment of an airplane, small frictions could ignite into larger conflicts. Dominic walked deliberately down the aisle, scanning faces, sensing anxiety and subtle resentment, weighing which interactions needed immediate attention and which could be observed quietly. Michael Anderson had retreated slightly into himself, sipping his beverage with a strained expression. Dominic noticed the small signs of frustration in the way his fingers tapped the armrest, the slight tightening of his jaw. It was clear that the temporary accommodation had not erased his sense of entitlement or impatience. People like Michael often required more than superficial gestures. They needed boundaries and firm leadership to recalibrate their expectations. At the same time, Dominic's gaze shifted to Marcus Ellison. Marcus appeared calm on the surface, but Dominic could sense the tension in his shoulders, the subtle tightening of his hands in his lap. Young men like Marcus often carried an invisible burden, the weight of social awareness layered over personal vulnerability. Dominic had learned to read these signs with precision, knowing that ignoring them could lead to unexpected complications. Rachel Hayes, moving quietly down the aisle, noticed a whispered argument between two passengers near the emergency exit. She paused, her voice low but firm as she intervened. "Please, let's keep the conversation respectful and avoid disturbing others. We want everyone to feel safe and comfortable." Her words carried a calm authority that diffused the rising tension almost immediately, Dominic observed, acknowledging that her intervention had created a subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere. Olivia Moore moved toward the back of the plane, offering quiet reassurance to passengers who seemed unsettled. Her gentle demeanor contrasted sharply with the rigid impatience of Michael, yet she commanded respect through her composed presence. Dominic appreciated the balance between assertiveness and empathy among his crew, recognizing that the emotional climate of the cabin depended on their coordinated efforts. A subtle incident occurred near the window seats. A passenger accidentally spilled coffee, creating a small mess that could have escalated into irritation or blame. Dominic moved quickly to assist, offering a kind but direct intervention. "Accidents happen. Let's clean this up together and ensure everyone remains comfortable." The tone was light yet authoritative, demonstrating leadership that combined practical action with empathy. Michael's eyes flicked toward Dominic again, a mixture of skepticism and begrudging acknowledgement. The young businessman was not yet fully compliant, but he had recognized that any overt confrontation would be fruitless. Dominic understood that this internal struggle within Michael was crucial to resolving the broader tension. Often, the most significant battles occurred within the minds of the individuals themselves, rather than through overt action. Meanwhile, Marcus spoke quietly to Lucas Porter, sharing his observations about the cabin environment. "It's fascinating how subtle gestures and calm words can prevent escalation. It's almost like they are conducting an orchestra of human emotions." Lucas nodded, his curiosity piqued. "I never thought about it that way. I just assumed the crew was doing their job mechanically. But now I see the strategy and intuition involved." Dominic felt a faint but perceptible shift in the cabin. The passengers were watching, processing the interactions, learning from the silent lessons of composure, empathy, and moral authority. Every small act, every measured word, contributed to a collective understanding of fairness and respect. The emotional climax began to surface as Michael's frustration reached an internal boiling point. Dominic observed the subtle signs: a tightening of his fists, a shallow breath, a hardening of the jaw. He approached Michael with measured steps, ready to assert control without provocation. "Sir, I can see this situation is challenging for you. I want to work with you to ensure your needs are met, but I need your cooperation in maintaining a calm environment for everyone. Michael's response was a mix of defiance and hesitation. I just don't understand why I should wait or compromise. I'm paying for a service, and it feels like I'm being treated unfairly. The words were sharp, but Dominic could detect the vulnerability underneath, the conflict between pride and reason. Dominic leaned slightly closer, his tone gentle but unwavering. Fairness does not mean immediate satisfaction at the expense of others. It means that everyone's needs are considered and respected. I ask for your patience, not as a favor, but as a necessary step to ensure a safe and respectful journey for all passengers. His voice carried calm authority, the kind that subtly demanded reflection rather than reaction. Rachel observed quietly, noting the tension coiling in Michael's demeanor. She suggested softly, perhaps offering a small, symbolic gesture could help him feel acknowledged without compromising fairness. Dominic considered this and nodded slightly. Subtle acts of acknowledgement could often redirect emotions more effectively than confrontation. Olivia approached with a small blanket and offered it with a warm smile. This might make your experience more comfortable. We want you to feel respected while we handle the cabin safely. The gesture was minor, almost inconsequential, yet it held a weight that Michael could not entirely dismiss. Michael hesitated, visibly struggling with his internal conflict. Dominic could feel the precise moment of decision approaching, the moment where pride and reason would clash. He allowed Michael a brief pause, understanding that forcing the moment could provoke resistance rather than compliance. Meanwhile, Sophie Reynolds watched quietly, her earlier panic now replaced by a sense of admiration for Dominic and his crew. The calm yet decisive handling of tension had created an environment where passengers felt secure, despite the underlying stress. She realized that leadership was not about eliminating conflict, but about navigating it with intelligence and empathy. Marcus whispered to Lucas again, "It's remarkable. They manage human behavior like a chess game, anticipating moves before they happen." Lucas nodded, understanding the subtle complexity for the first time. "I never realized how much thought and patience it requires. It's almost like art." Dominic's observation was unerring. He could sense that the emotional climax was near its peak. Michael's chest rose and fell rapidly, a sign of internal struggle. He was teetering between assertion and compliance, pride and reason. Dominic knew that this delicate balance required careful handling. Finally, Michael exhaled deeply, his hands loosening slightly. The gesture was small, but it signaled a shift. Dominic acknowledged it silently, maintaining his composed demeanor. "Thank you for your understanding. We are committed to ensuring everyone's needs are met fairly and safely." The words were simple, but the timing and tone reinforced the message more effectively than any argument could. The cabin's tension began to ebb subtly. Passengers who had been observing anxiously allowed themselves small sighs of relief. Marcus leaned back, recognizing the importance of restraint and empathy in maintaining peace. Lucas nodded in quiet agreement, impressed by the crew's ability to handle such complex dynamics. Rachel whispered to Dominic, "He's settled for now, but we must remain attentive. The underlying emotions are still present." Dominic nodded, fully aware that vigilance was a continuous requirement. The flight was not over, and human emotions remained unpredictable. Dominic moved toward the center aisle, reflecting on the broader implications. The microcosm of the plane represented societal dynamics on a larger scale: entitlement, frustration, empathy, moral courage, and composure all interacting in real time. Leadership was not just about authority. It was about creating an environment where fairness and respect could flourish even under stress. As the engines hummed steadily, Dominic allowed a brief, quiet acknowledgement of his own emotions. Relief mingled with vigilance, pride with humility. He recognized that moments like these tested not just his skills, but his character. Leadership required not only action, but patience, observation, and an unwavering commitment to principles of fairness and respect. The cabin remained tense, but stable. Dominic's interventions had prevented escalation, guided the emotional arc of the passengers, and reinforced the values he held dear. The turning point had passed, and now the focus shifted to maintaining equilibrium while preparing for the remaining journey. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the approach of the in-flight meal service. Yet a different tension lingered in the air. Dominic Carter felt it as a physical weight pressing on his chest. He walked down the aisle, his calm demeanor a deliberate contrast to the turbulence of human emotions that filled the confined space. Each passenger was a story, each face a subtle reflection of anticipation, frustration, or quiet observation. Today, the airplane was more than a vehicle. It was a crucible testing patience, fairness, and moral courage. Michael Anderson had regained a semblance of composure, but Dominic knew that this was only a temporary truce. Privilege and impatience often masked themselves in polite compliance until a perceived slight or delay triggered a resurgence of entitlement. Dominic's eyes followed Michael as he whispered to another passenger, a subtle comment laced with irritation, testing boundaries once more. Marcus Ellison remained observant, his hands folded neatly in his lap. There was a growing awareness in his eyes, an understanding that what was unfolding was a study in human behavior and ethical decisions. Dominic recognized the importance of Marcus's perspective. Young observers often internalize these moments, shaping their understanding of authority, justice, and integrity in profound ways. Rachel Hayes moved swiftly but quietly, attending to a passenger whose oxygen mask had slipped slightly. She spoke in a calm, measured voice, reassuring the man while resolving the situation with precision. Dominic noticed the synergy between Rachel and Olivia Moore, their actions almost choreographed, yet intuitive and responsive to the unpredictable environment. Their calm authority created a ripple effect, stabilizing passengers who had begun to exhibit signs of anxiety. Dominic's attention returned to Michael. The man's impatience was palpable, a tension coiling in his shoulders and neck. Dominic approached with deliberate calm. "Sir, I understand this situation is frustrating. We are doing everything possible to ensure a comfortable and fair experience for everyone. I ask for your cooperation and patience, not as a favor, but as a principle of mutual respect." His tone was unwavering yet empathetic, a balance of authority and moral clarity. Michael's response was sharp, tinged with disbelief. "I don't see why fairness should come at my expense. I am entitled to the service I paid for. Why should anyone else's comfort matter more than mine?" Dominic studied the man, sensing both the external assertion and the internal conflict. It was not defiance alone that drove him, but a fragile ego grappling with the reality of shared space and mutual respect. Olivia Moore interjected gently, placing a hand briefly on Michael's arm, a gesture of both acknowledgement and containment. "Sir, everyone's needs are important, including yours. That is why we approach this situation carefully. We are not dismissing your concerns. We are balancing them with the needs of all passengers." Her voice carried a soft authority, one that softened resistance without inviting confrontation. Marcus leaned slightly toward Lucas Porter and whispered, "This is a fascinating study in ethics and human behavior. It's like watching principles clash with personal desire in real time." Lucas nodded, his eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. It's more intense than I expected. You can feel the stakes even though it's just a flight. Rachel observed Dominic and Michael, noting subtle signs of escalation. She whispered to Dominic, "He's close to snapping. We need to anticipate the next move carefully. One wrong step and it could erupt." Dominic nodded silently. Anticipation and preparation were crucial. The most volatile moments often arose not from overt actions, but from unspoken pressures and internal struggles. A brief distraction occurred when a passenger's bag shifted in the overhead compartment, startling a nearby child. The sudden noise was enough to momentarily break Michael's focus, yet the irritation returned as quickly as it faded. Dominic used the moment to intervene, his presence calm and deliberate. "Please make sure the overhead compartments are secure. Safety is our priority, and cooperation ensures a smooth experience for everyone." The statement was practical, but it also reinforced authority without antagonism. Michael's internal struggle became more visible. His gaze shifted between Dominic, Marcus, and the observing passengers. There was an unspoken dialogue occurring within him, a battle between his sense of entitlement and an emerging recognition of collective responsibility. Dominic allowed him the space to grapple with this tension, knowing that direct confrontation could provoke further resistance. Rachel stepped in again, offering a subtle ethical reminder. We all share this space, and our actions affect one another. True fairness comes from consideration, not assertion alone. Her words, soft yet poignant, landed with an unexpected weight, reaching beyond compliance to touch conscience. Dominic took a deep breath, acknowledging internally that the ethical dimension of leadership was as vital as practical control. Commanding a situation required more than directing behavior. It demanded the cultivation of moral reflection in those involved. Michael was not merely a challenging passenger. He was a microcosm of societal dynamics, grappling with entitlement, empathy, and ethical choice. The internal battle reached its peak. Michael's fist clenched briefly, a sign of rising frustration, then relaxed as if a decision had crystallized. His exhale was audible, a release of both tension and resistance. Dominic observed closely, sensing that the critical moment had arrived. The question was not about compliance alone, but about understanding the principle behind the compliance. Marcus whispered to Lucas again. It's incredible how much influence calm integrity can have. One measured action can redirect an entire emotional trajectory. Lucas nodded, absorbing the lesson. The cabin had transformed into a silent classroom, where observation and reflection were as impactful as direct intervention. Dominic stepped closer to Michael, his voice low and firm. "Sir, the choice before you is not about immediate convenience, but about mutual respect and ethical responsibility. By embracing patience and fairness, you are not losing anything. You are ensuring a just environment for everyone, including yourself." The words were deliberate, each syllable carrying weight without aggression. Michael's gaze softened slightly, his body language hinting at tentative acknowledgement. The internal conflict was still present, but a shift had occurred. Dominic allowed silence to stretch briefly, a pause that invited reflection and self-realization. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, as if aware of the significance of this moment. Olivia handed Michael a small refreshment, a symbolic gesture that neither conceded nor intimidated, but reinforced respect and attentiveness. Michael took it, his hands shaking slightly, betraying the emotional intensity of the decision he had just made. Rachel whispered to Dominic, "The peak is past. Now we must maintain vigilance to ensure stability." Dominic nodded, recognizing that ethical decisions required follow-through. Integrity and leadership extended beyond singular moments. It involved sustained commitment and attentiveness. The passengers subtly relaxed. Marcus leaned back, a quiet admiration in his eyes. Lucas absorbed the nuances of human behavior unfolding before him. Sophie Reynolds, who had been anxious earlier, observed the cabin dynamics with newfound respect for the subtle power of ethical leadership. Dominic reflected silently on the broader lesson. The airplane had become a microcosm of society, where fairness, patience, and moral courage could triumph over entitlement and impatience. The confrontation had peaked not through force, but through a deliberate orchestration of empathy, authority, and ethical clarity. He felt a quiet pride in his team Rachel, Olivia, and Kevin, whose combined efforts had prevented escalation and guided passengers toward reflection and understanding. Leadership was not about control alone. It was about cultivating conscience, fostering ethical awareness, and creating an environment where fairness could prevail even under pressure. The engines continued their steady hum. The lights remained dim, and the cabin settled into a tense yet stable equilibrium. Dominic's thoughts lingered on the ethical dimension of human interaction, knowing that the journey was far from over, but reassured that critical lessons had been conveyed and absorbed. The airplane hummed softly as it glided through the sky, a gentle reminder of the physical journey the passengers were on. Yet for Dominic Carter, the true journey was less about altitude and more about the moral landscape that had unfolded inside the cabin. The turbulence of human emotions had settled, but the echoes of the confrontation still lingered, subtle and profound. He walked slowly down the aisle, observing the aftermath of choices and ethical engagement, noting the ripple effects that were already visible among the passengers. Marcus Ellison sat upright, his posture reflecting both relief and contemplation. The young man's mind was racing, trying to reconcile what he had witnessed. He turned to Lucas Porter and said quietly, "I've never thought about how small actions, calm words, or ethical clarity can literally change the behavior of others. It's like watching influence at work in real time." Lucas nodded, his gaze fixed out the window, the landscape below a blur. "I didn't realize how much patience and integrity mattered until I saw it with my own eyes," he admitted. Dominic approached Marcus, offering a subtle smile. "You're observing more than you think," he said gently. "What happens in these moments shapes your understanding of fairness, courage, and responsibility. It's easy to see conflict, but recognizing the ethics behind resolution is what lasts." Marcus's eyes widened slightly, a mix of admiration and introspection. "I never thought a flight could teach this much," he whispered. Rachel Hayes moved through the cabin, checking in on passengers who had been indirectly involved in the confrontation. She offered small gestures of reassurance, a kind word, a discreet acknowledgement, making sure that anxiety did not linger. Her presence, quiet and attentive, reinforced the sense of calm and fairness that Dominic had worked to establish. Kevin Brooks followed her lead, assisting where needed, and both demonstrated a professionalism that transcended routine duties. Olivia Moore was already engaging Michael Anderson in a conversation, softer now, less defensive. She framed questions with a gentle inquiry, encouraging reflection without accusation. "Sir, I hope the remainder of the flight has felt smoother," she said. "Moments earlier were challenging, but I hope you see the intention behind our actions was to create fairness for everyone." Michael's expression was conflicted, revealing an internal grappling that was subtle, yet profound. His voice was quieter, tinged with both acknowledgement and lingering resistance. I can see that," he admitted slowly. "It's just not something I usually think about in my daily life." Dominic observed this interaction, noting how the seeds of understanding were planted even in unexpected minds. Ethical reflection was rarely immediate or total. It required space, experience, and gentle confrontation. The subtle impact of words and actions often left a more enduring impression than loud declarations or punitive measures. He realized this cabin had transformed into a microcosm of societal engagement, where every choice was a lesson in empathy, fairness, and moral responsibility. Marcus's gaze shifted toward Dominic, curiosity and admiration evident in his expression. "Mr. Carter, how do you remain so calm when people are actively resisting what you believe is right?" he asked. Dominic paused, considering his words carefully. Calmness is not a lack of feeling. It is the ability to process emotion without being driven by it. Understanding that everyone has a perspective, even if flawed, allows you to act with integrity and patience. Sometimes the hardest part is standing still while chaos swirls around you. Sophie Reynolds, who had been visibly anxious earlier, approached Dominic hesitantly. Her voice was soft, almost tentative. "I just want to say thank you. I was scared, but seeing how you handled everything, it gave me a sense of safety." Dominic nodded warmly, feeling the genuine human connection. "Your feelings matter, and so does your trust. That's why every decision we make on board is deliberate, measured, and ethical. Safety is both physical and emotional." The cabin atmosphere shifted subtly, the collective consciousness of the passengers altered by the experience. Michael Anderson, while still uncomfortable, no longer displayed overt defiance. His posture relaxed slightly, and he avoided unnecessary confrontation. Dominic recognized this as a sign of internal reflection, the beginnings of acknowledgement that fairness and shared respect could coexist with personal interest. Rachel returned to Dominic with a report. "Passengers seem calmer now. Even those indirectly affected are showing signs of reflection. The ethical message is sinking in." Dominic nodded, appreciative of the observation. It reinforced the idea that leadership was a sustained process, a combination of immediate action and long-term moral influence. The cabin was quieter, yet the moral resonance was palpable, a subtle undercurrent of learning and growth. Lucas Porter leaned closer to Marcus. "I think I understand now why calm leadership works better than force. It's not about dominance. It's about influence and moral clarity." Marcus nodded, absorbing the lesson deeply. The young passengers were internalizing experiences that would likely shape their understanding of authority, fairness, and courage in ways that extended far beyond the flight. Dominic reflected on the broader implications. The flight was more than a confined space between two cities. It was a social laboratory where human behavior, ethical decision-making, and emotional intelligence were tested under pressure. His team's calm, consistent approach had prevented escalation while promoting reflection. Moments of confrontation were transformed into lessons in empathy and fairness, providing a living example of how ethical leadership can alter behavior constructively. He thought about the passengers, especially those like Michael who struggled with entitlement and resistance. Change was rarely immediate or complete, but it was possible when patience, ethical clarity, and calm authority intersected. Dominic understood that societal progress functioned similarly. Individual actions, small interventions, and consistent moral behavior could catalyze awareness and gradual transformation. As the meal service concluded, Dominic moved toward the front of the plane, pausing to observe the passengers quietly. The cabin was calm, conversations resumed naturally, and subtle nods of acknowledgement passed between those who had witnessed the earlier tension. The flight attendants continued their work with professionalism and empathy. reinforcing the lessons embedded in the interactions of the past hour. Rachel, Olivia, and Kevin shared brief glances with Dominic, a silent acknowledgement of the collective effort that had guided the cabin through turmoil. Leadership, he reflected, was never solitary. It relied on the integrity, skill, and empathy of those around you. Each passenger's response was part of a larger narrative, a story shaped by the combined actions of those entrusted with ethical responsibility. Marcus whispered to Lucas one final time before settling into his seat. "I'm going to remember this. Not just the events, but how people behaved and how calm, ethical leadership can actually make a difference." Lucas smiled faintly, a quiet agreement passing between them. The lesson was internalized, subtle yet profound, a reminder that human behavior was malleable and responsive to integrity. Dominic leaned back in his seat, observing the passengers' expressions. The tension that had once been sharp and immediate was now softened, replaced by reflection, awareness, and subtle gratitude. Ethical confrontation had achieved resolution, not through domination, but through moral clarity, patience, and empathy. The journey had reached a critical point, yet the broader impact extended far beyond the flight itself, offering a lasting lesson in the power of ethical human interaction. The engines thrummed steadily, a quiet symphony accompanying the moral and emotional navigation that had taken place within the cabin. Dominic Carter's gaze drifted toward the horizon outside the window, recognizing that while the flight would land, the lessons in human behavior, fairness, and courage would continue to resonate long after the wheels touched the ground. The plane descended gradually, the landscape below revealing a patchwork of fields, towns, and rivers glimmering under the late afternoon sun. For most passengers, the view was simply a sign of arrival. For Dominic Carter, it symbolized the conclusion of a moral and emotional journey that had unfolded over a few intense hours. Every decision, every carefully chosen word, every moment of patience had culminated in this quiet descent, yet the impact extended far beyond the visible horizon. Marcus Ellison adjusted in his seat, his hands clasped nervously in his lap. The events earlier had left a permanent mark on him. He thought about how he had initially reacted with confusion, fear, and skepticism. The confrontation between entitlement and fairness, confrontation and calm leadership, had left him thinking deeply about justice, integrity, and responsibility. He realized that life often demanded courage in subtle ways, through observation, restraint, and ethical action, rather than through loud declarations or visible power. Michael Anderson stared out the window, his usual confidence tempered by the morning's events. He had been forced to confront not just his entitlement, but his lack of empathy and understanding of the perspectives of others. The calm authority of Dominic Carter and the support of the flight crew had created a mirror, reflecting his own flaws and the social consequences of unchecked privilege. He clenched his jaw slightly, a mix of discomfort and recognition. Change was rarely comfortable, yet it was necessary. Dominic walked slowly down the aisle, his eyes scanning the cabin. He noted the subtle changes in posture, in expression, in the small gestures of acknowledgement exchanged among passengers. A woman sitting near the exit row caught his eye and nodded slightly. A silent, "Thank you." A man a few rows ahead smiled faintly, a recognition of the fairness that had been restored without escalation. These small gestures were powerful reminders that influence often manifests quietly, not in applause but in subtle shifts of awareness. Rachel Hayes approached Dominic, her expression calm but thoughtful. It's incredible to see how people respond when given space to reflect rather than pressured into submission. she said softly. Dominic nodded. Moments like these remind us that leadership is about more than control. It's about facilitating understanding and ethical engagement, even in environments as confined as an airplane. Lucas Porter leaned over to Marcus. I've never seen a situation handled with such composure and moral clarity. Watching how Dominic and the crew navigated conflict has changed how I think about my own interactions, he admitted. Marcus smiled faintly, a mixture of agreement and awe. It's like seeing a blueprint for how to respond when emotions run high. Calm, ethical action always wins, even if it's less dramatic than confrontation. Sophie Reynolds, who had experienced intense anxiety earlier, approached Dominic hesitantly. I can't express how much safer I felt knowing the situation was under control. Your calmness made it possible for me to breathe again, she said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. Dominic offered a reassuring smile. Your safety, both physical and emotional, is always the priority. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through careful choices and steady presence. As the plane continued its descent, Dominic reflected on the broader implications of the events. The flight was more than a literal journey. It was a condensed lesson in human behavior, ethics, and social responsibility. Each passenger, regardless of their initial position, had been given an opportunity to witness and internalize principles of fairness and integrity. Dominic understood that the smallest actions could ripple outward, influencing behavior and perspective long after the flight ended. Michael Anderson finally spoke, his tone quieter and more reflective than earlier. I never considered how my actions might affect others on such a personal level. Seeing the way you handled everything, it's humbling, he admitted. Dominic nodded, appreciating the honesty. Acknowledgement is the first step. Reflection and consistent ethical behavior come next. It's not about punishment. It's about growth and awareness. Rachel, Kevin, and Olivia continued to monitor the cabin quietly, their presence reinforcing the calm and ethical environment. Their teamwork had been crucial in diffusing tension, ensuring fairness, and promoting reflection among passengers. Dominic knew that leadership alone was insufficient without support and cooperation. The ethical framework of the flight crew had provided a model not only for resolving conflict, but for shaping behavior constructively. Lucas Porter whispered to Marcus again, I think this flight will stay with me for a long time. It's not just about what happened, but how it was handled. Calm, moral leadership really does make a difference. Marcus nodded, a contemplative expression settling over his face. I'll remember this. I'll try to carry it into my own life, even in smaller moments. Dominic glanced at the younger passengers, their reflections and awareness deepening. It reminded him that education and influence often occurred in unexpected moments. Social growth was rarely immediate, yet consistent exposure to ethical principles could plant seeds that would later flourish. The flight had become a microcosm for societal interaction, demonstrating the power of patience, empathy, and moral clarity in guiding human behavior. The engines hummed steadily, a soothing cadence that mirrored the resolution taking shape within the cabin. Dominic moved toward the cockpit briefly, speaking with the pilots to ensure all procedures were followed for a smooth landing. Returning to the aisle, he observed the passengers settling into a reflective quiet. Conversations resumed, but with a subdued tone, as if the shared experience had imparted an unspoken understanding among them. Rachel smiled at Dominic. We've done more than just manage a conflict. We've facilitated reflection, awareness, and perhaps lasting change, she said. Dominic returned the smile, acknowledging the collective effort. Leadership, he reminded himself, was never a solitary endeavor. It relied on collaboration, shared responsibility, and the ethical courage of those willing to act thoughtfully in challenging situations. Marcus turned to Lucas one final time. "I think I understand what calm leadership really means. It's not about winning arguments. It's about helping people see the right way to act, even if it's uncomfortable," he said. Lucas nodded, a quiet agreement passing between them. The lesson was subtle, yet profound, internalized through observation, reflection, and ethical demonstration rather than explicit instruction. The plane touched down smoothly, the wheels connecting with the runway in a controlled, deliberate landing. The cabin filled with the soft murmur of passengers gathering belongings, preparing to disembark. Yet beneath the ordinary sounds of travel, a sense of accomplishment lingered, an invisible thread of moral resolution woven through the air. Dominic Carter recognized that while the flight had ended physically, the lessons, reflections, and subtle transformations would persist far beyond the airport. As passengers began to exit, some approached Dominic with quiet words of gratitude. Marcus shook his hand, sincerity in his eyes. Michael offered a nod of acknowledgement, less defensive, more reflective. Sophie Reynolds gave a small smile, a gesture of personal closure. Each interaction, however brief, reinforced the central lesson: ethical action, calm leadership, and moral clarity could create profound and lasting impact, even in the most confined and pressured spaces. Dominic finally returned to his seat, gazing out the window as the runway lights disappeared behind the landing gear. The hum of engines faded, replaced by the anticipatory bustle of life outside the plane. He reflected on the journey, on the passengers, and on the subtle yet powerful transformations that had taken place. The flight was over, but the influence of ethical engagement, reflection, and calm leadership would continue, resonating quietly in the hearts and minds of those who had witnessed it. The experience had been intense, challenging, and revealing, but it had also been a reminder that change, understanding, and moral growth were always possible. Even in the skies, amidst tension and conflict, human behavior could be guided by integrity, patience, and empathy. The journey had ended, but the lessons endured. The plane has landed, the engine's quiet, but the lessons linger long after the passengers step onto solid ground. Dominic Carter's calm courage and unwavering integrity have shown that true leadership is not about force or intimidation. It's about patience, empathy, and doing what is right, even when no one is watching. Each passenger carried a piece of that lesson with them: the power of reflection, the responsibility of awareness, and the subtle strength in choosing fairness over entitlement. Yet the story also leaves a sharper sting. It reminds us how easily prejudice and entitlement can disrupt lives, and how much work remains in confronting discrimination, both visible and unseen. Moments like these demand introspection. How would you act in a similar situation? Could you choose courage, empathy, and ethical clarity when everything in the world urges you to stay silent or yield? We hope this story leaves you inspired, moved, and motivated to consider the impact of your own actions. Remember, change begins with small, deliberate choices, and one calm voice can shift the course of many lives. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping, thought-provoking stories. Join us and witness more moments where courage, justice, and humanity collide.